So the older the caregiver, the longer and more stressful, more difficult the care. 13% only report using respite care, and 7%, little over 7% of caregivers are paid for their work. Whoops. So that combined with the amount of work that you're doing is really, when you think about what's happening, and the mayor referred to some of the cuts and the challenges that local and state governments are facing in terms of providing care, with cuts to in-home support services, with scheduled cuts to adult day health care. More and more of the burden is going to rest on you, the caregiver. So I wanted to, before I move on to how do you take care of yourself, I want to show you these two other slides that I think, combined with these statistics, really is sort of provides the making of a perfect storm in terms of caregivers' care. So it's kind of hard to see some of this. This is from an essay that was written by Sarah Hahn Qualls about intergenerational care. And I like this diagram because it really illustrates for the folks that I see what their caregiving journey looks like. And so we compare it to child rearing, and a lot of people say to me, boy, caring for my dad, or it's like caring for a baby, and yet it never is, because the reverse happens when you're caring for a baby. The baby starts off being totally dependent and becomes increasingly interdependent, and then, to a great degree, independent as that baby grows into toddlerhood and etc., and adolescence, and then full adulthood. So when you're caring for a parent or a spouse, that journey goes in reverse. And it's a delight to care for your baby as your baby is growing up and becoming from dependence to independence. It's a very different story, caring for somebody who has started out being independent and is becoming increasingly dependent. So we see here some of that journey. What's missing here is full mutual autonomy. So you've got two adults, let's say you and your parent, or you and your spouse, who are both autonomous. Of course, you're dependent on each other in some ways, but you're both healthy, you're both living lives, in which you can perform, each of you, your own functions. And then often what happens, in my own case, I started seeing that, well, first my father, and that's a whole other story, but then my mother was becoming a little forgetful, increasingly anxious. So I was just sort of observing some changes in her handwriting was changing. There were things that I was noticing. The house wasn't as clean as it had been. And then, that journey continues with needing to provide a little more advice. She would turn to me to ask me for some help with some things in areas that she had normally been extremely sort of stubborn and independent about. And then as time went on, I started watching. I got a call one day from her doctor. She had missed her appointment, which was very unlike her. She was very organized. She always wrote everything down. And I noticed her calendar was kind of a mess, basically. Not as much of a mess as it became, but things were not in their right place. She had put the time down wrong. So there were things like that. And then as time went on, I and then my brother became more and more involved in assisting her, taking her places, getting her some help in the house, and, you know, until finally we ended up, we never, we didn't become her conservators, although we might as well have, but we were, you know, responsible for her in every single way, and she was completely dependent on us. So that's a pretty typical caregiver's journey. The only difference being, for some people, that can happen really quickly, but for most of us, it happens slowly, particularly if dementia is in the picture and people become slowly a little forgetful, they start slipping, their reasoning faculties are no longer as sharp, and very often we don't really notice, or another stressor, we don't really want, we can't take it in. So there often can be a lot of denial about what's going on in the family, which makes the difficulty of dealing with this even greater. So the next slide that I made up is just in relation to that first one, which has to do with self-care. And in the best of all possible worlds, and we know that there's no such thing really, but in the best of all possible worlds, the beginning of the caregiving journey involves two people who are both, to some degree, taking care of themselves, right? He plays tennis, she goes to the Y, or whatever it is that they do. Their eating habits, their self-care is sort of at the maximum. And of course, for some people, they've never really done much in terms of exercise or diet to take care of themselves. But at the beginning of the journey, we can hypothesize that people are taking care, as best care as they can, of themselves. And as time goes on, what happens, both people, both the care recipient as well as the caregiver, are able to take less and less care. However, it's really the caregiver who not only is able often to take less and less care of him or herself, but at the same time is taking more and more care, remember that first diagram, taking more and more care of the care recipient. So you've got the potential for a pretty disastrous picture, right? As you're taking care of your loved one more and more, very often you're taking less and less care of yourself. So that's why I call it sort of the perfect storm, because backed by all of that, we're seeing a decrease in a lot of services that used to be taken for granted in this state. Adult day care, adult day health care, plenty of funding for in-home support services, all of that. And all of these are, you know, on the chopping block or have already been cut. So this can describe a journey of increasing stress. And that journey of increasing stress sets in motion all kinds of physical and emotional consequences. Can we move this over a tiny bit? Oh, I guess that's good enough.